The house still smelled like flowers. We'd gone a little overboard with the peonies. My mom kept saying so, kept saying it in that gentle way she has, where she's not actually criticizing, she's just noting. But I'd wanted peonies ever since I was 12 years old and saw them in my aunt's garden in Kelowna, so peonies it was. Hundreds of them. Blush, pink and white, stuffed into mason jars and copper vases, and along every windowsill of the venue we'd rented out in Stratford, Ontario. A converted barn with string lights and a wraparound porch and a catering team that made the most incredible butter chicken poutine I have ever tasted in my life. It was a Saturday in late September, the kind of day where the air is sharp but the light is gold, where you keep expecting it to feel like fall, but it still feels like the very last gasp of summer. I got married in that light. I walked down the aisle toward the man I'd loved for 3 years, and I cried before I even reached him, which I had told myself I would not do. And then I saw that he was crying too, and then I really lost it. His name was Theo. Theo Harrington, 34 years old, civil engineer, the kind of man who remembered which coffee you ordered and showed up with it without being asked. He had this habit of putting his hand on the small of my back when we walked into rooms together. Not possessively, just present, like he was always quietly saying, "I'm here, I'm with you." I'd spent the first 6 months of our relationship waiting for the catch, because there's always a catch, and then I'd spent the next 2.5 years deciding that maybe, sometimes, there isn't one. I was 31 when we got married. I'm a physiotherapist. I work at a clinic in Guelph. I have an apartment. Well, had an apartment. We just moved into our house together the month before the wedding. And I have a younger sister named Holly, and a mother who cries at commercials, and a father who doesn't say much but shows up every single time. Ordinary life. Good life. The kind I'd built carefully and deliberately, and was proud of. We left for our honeymoon on the Monday. 2 weeks in Portugal, Lisbon first, then the Algarve, then a few nights in Porto to end on. Theo had planned most of it. He was the planner between us. I was the one who said yes to things, and then got overwhelmed by spreadsheets. We had a hotel in Lisbon with a rooftop that looked out over the Tagus River, and the first night we sat up there with a bottle of local wine until 2 in the morning, not even talking much, just being there. I want you to hold that image for a second. That rooftop, that river. 2 weeks of our lives that were supposed to be the beginning of everything. We came home on a Thursday. I went back to work the following Monday, still jet-lagged, still floating a little. Theo took an extra week off to deal with some things around the house. We'd bought a semi in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Guelph, older home, needed work. And there was a long list of small repairs that kept expanding every time he looked at a wall. It was a Tuesday when the call came. I was between patients. I had 12 minutes before my next appointment. I was eating a granola bar at my desk. I was reading a text from my mom about whether we were coming for Thanksgiving dinner in 2 weeks, and my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Area code 519. Local. I almost didn't answer. I was tired, and I had granola bar crumbs on my scrubs, and I was not in the mood for a telemarketer. But I answered, "Is this Jess?" "Jess Harrington?" A woman's voice, professional, careful. "This is Jessica Harrington, yes." "Can I ask who's calling?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but I noticed it. "My name is Dr. Sandra Okafor. I'm calling from Elmswood Medical. I need to speak with you about some recent test results. Not your own, but results that have a direct bearing on your health. I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I sat up straighter. I set down the granola bar. "Okay," I said. "Are you somewhere private right now? And is your husband with you?" "I'm at work," I said. "He's at home. What's going on?" Another pause. Shorter this time, like she'd been waiting for that answer. "I'd like you to come in," she said. "Today if possible. or first thing tomorrow morning. There are some things I need to discuss with you face to face. And Jessica, I'd prefer if you didn't mention this call to your husband before we've had a chance to talk. I remember the granola bar wrapper crinkling in my hand. I remember the sound of the hallway outside my office, a patient's walker clicking past, someone laughing at the reception desk. I remember thinking, this is a very strange thing for a doctor to say. Can you give me any idea what this is about? I asked. I'll explain everything when I see you, she said. I'm sorry to be vague. I know this must feel alarming. But please, come in first and then we'll talk. Can you do that? I told her I could come after my last patient. She told me she'd stay late. I sat at my desk for a moment after I hung up and just breathed. Then I went in and treated my next patient, and I did not think about it. That sounds impossible. But it's a skill I developed working in healthcare. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to be fully present in the room you're standing in, because you don't get to be somewhere else in your head when someone is trusting you with their body. So I worked. I did my job. I answered my mom's text about Thanksgiving. I ate the rest of the granola bar, and at 5:45, I drove to an address I didn't recognize and sat in a parking lot for 3 minutes trying to calm down before I went inside. Elmswood Medical was a small, private clinic, the kind that's nicer than your average walk-in but not flashy about it. Warm lighting, plants in the waiting room, a front desk that was already closed for the day. A woman in her late 40s met me at the door herself. Dr. Okafor, I assumed, and she confirmed it. She had a steady handshake and a direct way of looking at you that I respected immediately. She walked me to a small office at the back and closed the door. Thank you for coming, she said. I know this is irregular. I want to explain why I called you directly. She told me that Theo had come to the clinic about 6 weeks before the wedding. That he'd come alone. That he had expressed concern about a possible STI exposure and had asked to be tested without his partner's knowledge. She said this was not uncommon. People had their reasons, and the clinic was a private facility, and confidentiality was standard practice. But there was a part of Ontario's public health framework, she told me, and here she was careful, measured, that required healthcare providers to notify partners in certain circumstances. Not to break confidentiality, but to ensure that people who may have been exposed had the opportunity to be tested and treated. His results indicated something that requires your awareness, she said. I want to be clear. I am not here to tell you the details of his diagnosis. What I am here to tell you is that you should be tested. Today, if you're willing. And I'm also here to tell you, because I believe you have a right to know this, that the exposure he reported did not come from you. I think I already knew what she meant. I think I'd known it in the parking lot. Maybe even from the moment she'd asked me whether Theo was with me. He told you about someone else, I said. She looked at me steadily. He indicated that the potential exposure occurred through contact with another person. Yes. I nodded. My hands were very still in my lap. I noticed that later, how still my hands were. How long before the wedding did you say he came in? 6 weeks. We had been together for 3 years. He had proposed 14 months ago in the backyard of his parents' house in Hamilton with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and a speech that made me cry. We had spent 14 months planning a wedding. He had given a toast at our reception the night before last in front of 92 people. He had cried during his vows. 6 weeks before all of that, he had been somewhere. He shouldn't have been with someone he shouldn't have been with, and he had been scared enough to come to a private clinic alone. And then he had stood in the light of a converted barn in Stratford and cried during his vows. I'd like to be tested, I said. Please. Dr. Okafor was kind about it. She was efficient, and she was kind, and she did not make me feel small, which I appreciated more than I can say. She told me the results would take a few days, and that she would call me personally. She gave me her direct line. She walked me to my car. I drove home. Theo was in the kitchen when I got there. He'd made pasta. He made pasta about twice a week. It was his easy default meal. And the apartment smelled like garlic and olive oil, and he turned around and smiled when he heard the door and said, "Long day?" I made the lemon one. I said, "Yes, long day. Thank you for cooking." I sat down and I ate the pasta. I want to be honest about what those days were like, because I think people expect a certain kind of dramatic collapse, and that's not what happened. I didn't cry on the kitchen floor. I didn't confront him that night or the night after. I didn't call my sister or my best friend or my mom. I just moved through the days like I was underwater. Still seeing patients, still doing laundry, still sleeping in the same bed, on my side, not touching him, though I'd always slept on my side, so he didn't notice. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I said anything. That's who I am. I'm a person who needs the full picture before I can figure out what to do with it. I've been that way my whole life. So I waited. I waited and I paid attention. I started noticing things I'd filed away without meaning to. Small things, the kind that make no sense in isolation, but start to form a shape when you line them up. The way his phone was always face down now, the way he'd taken to showering as soon as he got home, before dinner, which he'd never done before. A weekend in March, 8 months ago, when he'd said he was going to visit a friend from university in Ottawa, and I'd believed him without question, because why wouldn't I? A night in June when he'd been strange and quiet, and I'd assumed it was work stress, because he was always stressed in summer when the big project deadlines piled up. The shape that formed was not a good one. On the fourth day, Dr. Okafor called. My results were clear. I was okay. I exhaled so hard I had to sit down, and then I started crying, which I hadn't done yet, and then I stopped, because there was still so much I hadn't figured out. What I did next, I did quietly and without announcing it. I called a family lawyer, a woman I found through the Law Society of Ontario website, someone I'd never met and had no connection to. I specifically wanted someone Theo and his family didn't know. Her name was Andrea Chung, and she had an office in Kitchener, and she was direct and practical in a way that steadied me. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me what my options were, what the process would look like, what I needed to document and preserve, and what I should and shouldn't say or do in the meantime. Don't move money, she said. Don't make any major purchases or cancel anything shared. Just document. I documented. I went through our shared accounts. We'd set up a joint Cheekwing account for household expenses after we bought the house, which was 3 months ago, which meant it was relatively new. I looked at the history. I looked at it very carefully. There was nothing that shouted at me, no hotel receipts or flower deliveries to wrong addresses. But there was a pattern of e-transfers to a personal account I didn't recognize, semi-regular going back to the spring. 100 here, 200 there, nothing enormous, nothing that couldn't be explained away as any number of ordinary things, but nothing he'd mentioned to me, either. I took screenshots. I sent them to Andrea. I want to be clear. I wasn't building a case because I wanted to win something. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was building a case because I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before I could make a decision, and I needed to protect myself while I figured it out. I'd worked hard for what I had. I'd paid off my student loans 3 years ago. I'd saved carefully. I'd contributed to my RRSP every year since I was 25. This was my life too, and I wasn't going to blow it up on emotion before I understood the shit of things. 11 days after Dr. Okafor called me, we met my friend Kelsey and her husband for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Guelph. A normal Saturday night plan we'd made weeks ago, nothing unusual about it. It was a nice place, the kind with low lighting and a good wine list, and the sort of menu that takes itself seriously without being pretentious. We'd been there before. I'd suggested confirming the reservation, and Theo had said yes, of course, and none of it was strange. I told Kelsey in advance. Just her, no one else. I needed one person in that room who knew, and I needed it to be someone who could hold it steady. Kelsey has known me since we were 17. She is the least reactive person I've ever met, and she looked at me when I told her and just said, "Okay, I'm there. What do you need me to do?" I told her I needed her to be normal all evening and then stay after, and she said she could do that. The four of us had dinner. It was, genuinely, a pleasant evening in many ways. The food was good. Kelsey's husband was funny. There was a whole conversation about cottage country real estate that I will never be able to eat risotto without thinking about now. Theo was relaxed. He laughed. He put his hand on my back when we walked to the table. After Kelsey's husband excused himself and Kelsey gave me the smallest possible nod, I looked at Theo across the table. I said his name, just his name. Something shifted in his face when I said it that way. People know, I think. They know when it's coming. Something animal in them registers the change in tone before the mind catches up. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything." He nodded. So I told him. I told him about Dr. Okafor's call. I told him that I knew he'd gone to the clinic 6 weeks before our wedding. I told him I knew the exposure hadn't come from me. I told him I'd had myself tested and that I was fine, but that I'd spent 11 days sitting with this information, and I'd used those days to speak with a lawyer, and I was giving him this information now as a courtesy, not as an opening to a conversation. I told him I wanted him out of the house. I told him I had already called his mother. His parents were our closest logistical overlap. We'd bought the house partly because it was 20 minutes from them, and she deserved to know. And that she was expecting him to call her tonight. I told him that Andrea Chung's office would be in touch with him in the coming days. He started to talk. I knew he would. There was a whole speech in there. I could feel it. The apology, the explanation, the "it was only," the "you have to understand," the "I was going to tell you," and I put my hand up, flat, and I said, "Don't," not loudly, quietly. "I don't want the explanation tonight. I don't have the capacity for it tonight. If you need to talk to someone right now, call your mom. Call a friend. But I need you to pay the check and leave, and I need you to not be at the house when I get home." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He paid the check. He said my name once, very quietly, in a way that sounded like the beginning of something, and then he seemed to think better of it. He picked up his jacket. He left. Kelsey didn't say anything for a while. She just reached across the table and held my hand, and we sat there while the restaurant moved around us. "Do you want dessert?" she said eventually. I laughed. It was the right thing to say. "Yeah," I said, "I really do." The weeks after that were not a movie. There was no triumphant moment, no clear line where things became okay. There was a lot of paperwork. There was a lot of crying in my car, which is where I tend to cry. Not in front of people, not at home, but in parking lots with the engine off, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. There was a very difficult phone call with Theo's mother, who is a good woman and was devastated, and who said things to me that I believe she meant and that I have still not fully processed. There was a conversation with my own parents that I dreaded and that turned out to be fine, because my dad showed up on my doorstep 2 days later with a casserole and a new set of kitchen door hinges, because the hinges had been squeaking, and he'd been meaning to fix them for weeks, and he just stood there and fixed them without making it into anything. And I cried in the kitchen while he did it, and he pretended not to notice, which was exactly what I needed. There were conversations with Theo, eventually. I did let him explain. It was someone he'd worked with, someone on a project in Toronto that had run for most of the previous year. It had started in the fall and ended. He said in the spring, before he'd come to the clinic. He said he'd ended it. He said he'd told himself it was over and that he would just carry it and it would never matter because it was done. I listened to all of it. Then I told him that I didn't hate him. I told him that I genuinely, actually, did not hate him. Not in the way I'd expected to, when I'd imagined this conversation during those 11 days. I told him that what I felt was something closer to grief, and that grief was going to take time, and that I was not going to spend that time in a marriage where I was already grieving. I don't think you're a bad person, I said. I think you did a bad thing. I think you made a choice and then made another choice, and then made 100 more choices to protect that first one. And somewhere in there you stopped seeing me clearly. And I think I deserve to be with someone who sees me clearly. He said he still loved me. I said I knew. I said I believed him. I also said goodbye. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Ontario has its process, and it takes time, and Andrea Chung was worth every dollar I paid her. The house was sold. The market in Guelph was still reasonable. We got a fair price. We split it cleanly. My half went into a separate account that has only my name on it, and I moved into a rental in a part of town I'd always liked. Near the river, near a coffee shop I started going to every morning like it was a religion. I have a friend who keeps asking me when I'm going to start dating again, and I keep telling her I'll know when I know. That's not a deflection, it's just the truth. What I know right now is this. I am 32 years old. I have a job I love, in a field that means something to me, where I watch people recover from things that seemed unsurvivable. I have a sister who makes me laugh harder than anyone on earth. I have parents who show up. I have a coffee shop near the river and a rental with good light in the morning, and a life that is smaller than the one I had, and also, in some ways, cleaner. I built it. I keep building it. Someone called me on a Tuesday afternoon between patients and told me to come alone. And I did. And everything fell apart, and then I put it back together myself, piece by piece, into something that actually fit. I think that's enough.